In the 1970s, a boy began having these horrible dreams.
Right, but he later found out that they weren't just dreams, they were memories.
Yeah, but the only problem was these memories, they were of events that couldn't possibly have happened.
Welcome to Velarcana. Here, we share mysteries that often defy explanation. I research the cases, and my husband tells the stories.
And this one begins with a nightmare. The dream always started the same way. Scott was asleep on the couch, which of course was not his bed, and this wasn't his house. Well, his mother comes over to him, she wakes him up, and she tells him that it's time to go. She picks him up, tosses him over her shoulder, and then starts to move across the room. And even though this was supposed to be a dream, it always seemed extremely real. So real, in fact, that Scott could even remember feeling the warmth of her skin as his head slumped against her neck. Well, she carried him outside and headed toward the car. Scott was groggy, but he could see that it was still dark out. When they got to the car, Scott saw that there were two people already in the back seat. Scott's mother sat in the front seat, and then Scott's father got in, and they were off. Scott remembered that the car bumped quite a bit, as if they weren't on a paved road. And for some reason, there was a lot of anxiety in the car. From where Scott sat, he could easily see out through the back window, and he could see dust flying up behind the car. The tires must have been kicking up grit from the dirt road. The tiny particles of dirt were being shot up into the air behind the car and then floating off as dust particles into the blackness. And at some point during all of this, that anxiety that I just mentioned, well, it suddenly shot up and went through the roof. Everyone started to panic. Scott's mother shouted that the car needed to go faster. And Scott's father shifted gears, pressed down hard on the gas pedal, and said that the car just wouldn't go any faster. And the two people in the back seat had a look of absolute terror on their faces. And Scott really had no idea exactly what was happening, but he was starting to get the impression that something dangerous was approaching the car. So he looked around, and at first, he didn't see anything. It was just dark outside. But there had to be something out there, something that was coming toward the car. But what was it? Well, he kept scanning, and a second later, he saw it, and it was huge, nearly as big as the sky, and it was glistening as it moved, and it moved fast, heading directly for his family. It moved so fast, in fact, that it was only seconds from the very moment that he saw it to when he got right up to the car. And then, everything changed. It rocked the car hard. It completely took control of the direction of the car, and it busted out the back window. Glass went flying, and shards of it actually embedded themselves into the head and shoulders of the two people in the back seat. It was madness. And then, a split second later, something grabbed a hold of Scott, and it started pulling him toward the window. But his mother tightened her grip, and for just a moment, in the middle of chaos, Scott found himself being pulled in two directions. His mother on one side, of course unwilling to let go, and then whatever this thing was on the other. And this thing, well, it wanted Scott, and from the very moment that it grabbed a hold of him, its grip was so strong that Scott knew it wasn't going to let go.
It was a very terrifying thing I remember of my mother was being ripped away.
You may be thinking about this point that, come on, this is just a dream. But to Scott, this was insanely real. And remember, he thought that all of this had come from a memory. Well, the next thing that happened in his dream was this thing tightened its grip and pulled him out the window. And then it began to suffocate him, and he could feel it. And at the same time, he also felt as if he was being wrapped up in some type of a sludge-like liquid. And then there was this bright light, and shortly after that, he woke up. There were a couple of other details in these dreams, a couple of other significant events, and we'll get into them in the very next segment. But, and as I said in the beginning, he had this strong feeling, this knowingness, that this event, although insanely bizarre, had actually happened, that he was dreaming something that had already taken place. The only problem was, no one else in his family could remember this event. And you would think that, if nothing else, his mother would, right? Someone snatching her baby away from her through the car window? But no, she had no memory of this at all. And all of this just might have stayed in the realm of dreams, just a puzzle to be worked out. But then he started having these flashes of memory during the day. These horrible nightmares were pretty much always the same, and Scott continued to have them well into his 20s. There were a few more details than what I gave you in the last segment. Most of them weren't really significant. For example, he was able to recall small things, like how loud the screen door sounded when it slammed shut as they were leaving, or how clearly he could remember the clothing of the two people in the back seat. The boy was wearing blue denim overalls, and his shoes were worn. And the girl, well, she was in a white lacy dress with a flowery design on it. And although insignificant to the story, I guess they did add some validity to the idea that these were more like memories than nightmares, right? And as I mentioned, there were a couple of details that were probably pretty significant. First, and this is strange, at the very moment that he began to suffocate, he stopped being afraid. He said that all of a sudden, this feeling of perfect calmness came over him, and it was right about then that he saw that light. He said that the light was big and was powerful, maybe a spotlight or a searchlight. He said that it was as bright as the sun. And the other thing that he remembered was that he was pulled up out of this liquid toward the light, and once he broke the surface, he said that all around him was just devastation. And then he said he remembered being accelerated at a high rate of speed upward. And the higher he went, the faster time seemed to pass. He said it was like a movie that was being sped up. And then, that's it. He'd wake up. These dreams, or I guess nightmares, as I said, were always the same. And he said that he started having them around the time that he was 3 years old, or maybe even a little earlier, which seems odd, right? I mean, how could he remember something from such a young age? He would have to be, what, maybe 1 or 2 years old when this tragic event happened? Well, a little later in his life, he began to have these flashes of memory, and they almost always centered around his mother. The only problem was, his mother? Well, she wasn't his mother.
I was in my backyard playing wiffle ball, and I see my mother come out of the back door of the garage. That's when I had a flash in my mind's eye. It's like it took over what I was seeing.
And what he is aware is that he is sitting on the porch of his house holding a Raggedy Ann doll, which he adores. And he's watching his mother.
Wind was blowing a tuft of hair in the front of her head. She had hair tied up in a bun, and a little piece of hair and a bun had gotten loose. And she saw me looking at it, and she tucks it back in and just smiled at me. Felt love like I'd never felt before.
A moment later, the memory faded into the past, and Scott found himself playing a wiffle ball again. Sometime after that, Scott's mother took him out shopping, and at one point, they ended up at this consignment shop. And he walked around for a bit, and then he entered this small room. Well, there were plenty of items in there for him to look at, but one in particular caught his eye. On one of the shelves, he saw an old-time Hershey bar.
It's like I recognized it immediately, but when I touched it, that's when I flashed on having memory of walking into a door that I'd never been in.
In this memory, everything was different. He said that he felt like he was standing in a place from another time. But strangely, he also felt like everything was oddly familiar.
He felt like he knew the proprietor, and the proprietor said, you want some candy? And took him over and showed him that candy.
In this memory, among the variety of candy that was in front of him, Scott spotted a Hershey bar wrapped up like he had never seen before. Well, his mother bought it for him, and then they shared a moment that etched itself into Scott's mind.
I felt content being able to share that with my mother. She took a piece and bit into it and smiled and asked, it said to me, "It's good, isn't it, honey?" And I said yes, and feeling so happy.
Another time, around dusk, while Scott was out playing in his backyard, his mother called him in for dinner.
I come up to the door, my mother said I had a June bug on my shirt. And when I heard the name June bug, it felt like so familiar that I had heard that before. And I didn't know the significance of it, but it was so strong a feeling that it was important.
Scott would soon learn the significance of those words, Junebug, and we'll share that significance with you in just a minute. But as I stated earlier, one of the strangest things about these memories was that the woman in the memories wasn't Scott's mother.
One thing that I recognized the most was noticing that the woman in my memories, even though she was my mother, I knew she was not my mother. My mother did not look like this at all.
Now that's strange. Having memories of your mother, but she's not your mother? Right about now, you're probably beginning to suspect what Scott said that he guessed very early on. He believed that somehow he had lived before with another family as another person. But dreams and feelings are one thing, and reality, of course, is a whole different story. There couldn't possibly have been any real evidence for this, right? Scott Allen Perry was born in Troy, Ohio on March 15, 1970, and he moved to Decatur, Illinois when he was very young. And it was during his early years in Decatur when he first started to believe that he had lived as another person. One night, his nightmare was so intense that he woke up screaming.
And that's when I woke up, screaming my head out. I died. You know, and the thing is, I went from laying in bed to I'm actually hugging the foot clothes at the foot of the bed.
Right about that point, Scott's parents rushed in, and they assured him that it had only been a dream and that everything was okay now. But Scott knew differently. These dreams were too clear. They were too intense. It was right around this point that he realized that that huge glistening object that was rushing toward the car in his dream, well, it was actually a wall of water. Scott was convinced that he had died in some type of a flood. Over the next few years, he tried to tell his parents this, but they didn't want to hear it. His parents were deeply religious, and their religion didn't allow them to believe in such things as reincarnation. During a church service, right around the time that he was 7 years old, the preacher was saying that when one dies, he or she goes to heaven or goes to hell. And that's when Scott, sitting in one of the pews, nudged his father and whispered, "That's not right, Dad. When a person dies, he or she has a choice. That person can come back." Well, his father did not want to hear that at all, and Scott got a strong reprimand. So after that, he learned to keep quiet. At first, he had these dreams several times a month, but as he got older, they became less and less frequent. He moved out around the age of 18, and these dreams of this horrible death stopped altogether somewhere in his mid-20s. And of course, he never forgot, but for a while, it just became some bizarre mystery. That is, until April of 2004. Scott, his sister, and his nephew were all watching television when an ABC special about the reincarnation of James Linenger came on. And during the special, they showed how Lininger's memories matched up with a man's real-life experiences. And the coincidences? Well, they were just too much. Well, sometime during the show, Scott's nephew asked if past lives were a real thing. And Scott's sister said, "I don't know. Ask your Uncle Scott. He has a past life memory." Well, this took Scott completely by surprise. He never really spoke of this to his sister. So he asked her, how did she know? And she said, how could she not? She said that she remembered all of those nights when Scott, as a young child, would wake up screaming at the very top of his lungs that he had died. Well, after that night, Scott decided that he wanted to look for any evidence of a family of 5 dying in a mudslide. He had this strong feeling that it probably took place somewhere in the 1930s, so he started searching the internet, and he found nothing. There was absolutely no evidence of a family of 5 dying in a mudslide the way that he had dreamed it, so after a while, he kind of gave up. or at least he put the search on the back burner. But then, in February of 2019, he was watching a show on YouTube called Hollywood Graveyard, and they were doing this story on twin boys who had died in a flood in the early morning hours of New Year's Day, 1934, in Montrose, California. And for some reason, the word Montrose stuck out in Scott's mind. So he rushed to the computer and he typed in the search bar, "Family of 5 dies in flash flood, New Year's Day, Montrose, California, 1934. And this picture popped up.
When I first saw the picture of the car on the internet, I was awestruck completely, to my core. I immediately knew this was where I had lost my entire family.
So this wall of mud and rocks, probably 10 to 15 feet high, was roaring down Rubio Canyon.
On New Year's Eve, 1933, John and Elizabeth Moore and their daughter, June, whom they often called Junebug, had all went to a friend's house, the Hubbards, for a double celebration. New Year's Eve and their friend's son Sherman's honorable discharge from the Marine Corps. Well, the celebration was nice, and as things began to wind down, the Moores and a couple of other people at the party made a plan to go back to the Moores' home so that they could all get up early the next morning and then go to the Rose Bowl parade together. So just after midnight, John, Elizabeth, and June got into the front seat of their 1930s sedan, while Sherman and his sister Ethel got into the back. A man named Earl Dennison hopped onto the rumble seat on the outside of the car, and the family was off. The car pulled out onto a dirt road and then headed to the Moores' home in Rosemead, California. Now, a couple of months before this, there had been a bunch of wildfires in the hills above this area.
There was a huge fire on the San Gabriel Mountains above this area in November. Then in December, it started to rain heavily. And at midnight on December 31st, it just cut loose. The mountains absorbed this huge amount of rain, and the mud on the mountains just disintegrated and went down into these flood control channels. And one of them came down Rubio Canyon and crossed into the San Gabriel Valley. It was a huge ball of a large mass of mud and rocks, and it just churns and it turns into a wall. Now, the Moore family came down Rush Street to go up to their house, which was just a few blocks away. And as they crossed the bridge, or just before they crossed the bridge, this huge, massive debris slug hit the bridge and took their car with it.
Some people believe that Scott's reoccurring nightmare and this horrible tragedy that happened to the Moore family have too many similarities to just be coincidence. In Scott's dream, 5 people left a house while it was still dark out. They got into a car and they traveled down a dirt road. And then at some point, they were hit by a huge wall of water where everyone drowned. And in reality, seemingly, the Moore family went through pretty much the same thing. There was the discrepancy, of course, of Mr. Dennison hopping onto that rumble seat. But many people argue that little June wouldn't necessarily have remembered that, because the rumble seat was on the outside of the car, and June may not have seen that man hop on. And if she didn't see it, well, she wouldn't have been able to remember it, and then it wouldn't be in the dream. After researching Scott's case, Amy got in touch with Dr. Jim Matlock. He's a retired anthropologist who now spends quite a bit of time investigating cases like Scott's. And as a matter of fact, he had done an extensive study on Scott's case. So we reached out to him, and he agreed to sit down with us and give us an interview. Tell me about meeting Scott.
Okay, are we on now?
We're on, yes.
We're on. Okay. Well, I arranged to meet Scott at his home and met him there. But he struck me as being very real, I guess, is the best way that I can say it. Very honest and genuine.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you was, these weren't memories, right? This was a dream.
Scott's nightmare, though, is very characteristic of what's called a replicative post-traumatic nightmare. This is something that's known from this life PTSD things, like, war injury, something like this. The memories are like replayed in dreams, like over and over and over again, the same way they are in Scott's case, except that with Scott, the memory was not of his present life, the memory was of a previous life, right, of June.
Isn't it possible that Scott, his dream was just a coincidence?
Yeah, but how could it be? But the coincidences just pile up then. I mean, there's just all of these coincidences because he had the right number of people in the car, right? He had the right relations to each other, or, a seeming sense of them. He had the right details of just when this happened. He had the right details on the car, the type of car. It's just...
And you don't believe that there's an element of fraud, right? Like, he learned of this stuff, and then he was like, hey, look at my experience.
Right. Okay, that's a really good question, the element of fraud. And that is the thing that a lot of skeptics fall back on. They can't find any other way to explain these phenomena. And so the only answer left is that there's fraud. I don't see it. I just don't. Because I met with Scott. I talked with him. He came across as genuine. I talked with his nephew. I talked with his mother. And everything adds up. Everything was consistent. I mean, that's over a period of years, right? And so that also tells me that this is for real.
On November 11, 2023, the Autonomy Media flew Scott out to California for an upcoming documentary that they're planning on doing about his life. Since journalist Mike Lawler knew so much about the case, and since he already lives in Southern California, they asked him if he would shuttle Scott around while Scott was in town. After Mike picked Scott up from the airport, they went to Roosevelt Memorial Park in Gardenia and visited June's and June's family's graves.
I stood in front of all 5 headstones. The reality hit me that I had actually found them. And I knelt down and placed flowers on each headstone. I reached over and I touched June's headstone. I was overcome emotionally. I don't normally cry like that. I was immediately started sobbing.
And we did indeed place flowers on the grave, and Scott, he sobbed, he cried, he was very emotional, and I hope it helped him. I hoped it kind of exorcised those spirits that have been haunting him all his life.
Stick around. The DNA is next, and find out what Amy and I think about Scott's story. One of the biggest challenges I have with this story is when Scott tells it, he tells it as if there's anxiety in the car early on, right? So the Moores, the Hubbards, they get into the car and they're heading to the Moores house. And the only reason they're going is because the parade, the Rose Bowl parade's the next day. And they're going to the Moores house so they can leave from there to go to the parade. But there's anxiety in the car way before there should be any, because there shouldn't have been, they had no idea that this wall of water was going to come down the mountain and wash their car away at the bridge. So the anxiety should have started the moment that Mr. Moore, Mrs. Moore, whatever, sees the wall of water, which is seconds before the water hits the car. Yet, according to Scott, there was anxiety building in the car. So
Right.
what do you make of that?
Well, okay, let's think about real life and real life dreams. If we have something absolutely shocking happen to us, we are going to have massive anxiety about that event. Well, when we dream about it, right, it's a dream. Our dream, we might, say, well, a half an hour before that, I was really stressed in the dream. I'm all, discombobulated and have so much anxiety of that event, right? Because I'm dreaming about it.
I get you.
Right? But it doesn't.
Yeah.
It doesn't make it. That's evidence that it's not real.
Right.
These are dreams.
So you're kind of saying, like, if something traumatic happens to me and then I dream about it later, in the dream I might have anxiety earlier than I really did.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's a dream of the traumatic event.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I wrote something in my notebook about this. I wanted to get this from Dr. Matlock's paper because I feel like it's interesting. He actually calls it time compression. And that is that theory that, time compresses in dreams. We don't have the maybe exact timing right in our dreams, but they are dreams of that event. So
Gotcha.
I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that makes sense.
So what do you think about Scott's case?
Well, now that you cleared that up for me, I have to say, you know me, I'm real skeptical. But when I think about the odds on the coincidence, like when I talked to Dr. Matlock, right? And Scott knew how many people were in the car. He knew the relationships between the people. He knew that he was the child and there was the father and the mother in the front seat. He knew that there was two people in the back seat. He knew the car was on a dirt road. He had an idea that it was from the 30s. The odds of that really make me go, Now I have to say, I'm still skeptical. I have no idea, but it does make me wonder.
Right.
What about you? What do you think?
Right. Well, after talking with Scott for hours on the phone and then doing my research, of course, like I always do, and then talking to Mike Lawler, right, who is completely agnostic on this, but his jam is history, right? And he knows the history of the area. After talking with him, I was really convinced that this is a case of past life memory, that this is a case of reincarnation because of all the evidence pointing to the fact that Scott did know all of that without ever talking to anybody in that area, without ever knowing the history of the flood. He didn't even know about this flood.
Yeah, that's what gets me.
Yeah. So, and it really reminds me of the Jenny Kickel case, right? So Jenny Kickel talks about her reincarnation of Mary Sutton. And one of the most interesting things about that case to me was she writes about the time in between. So the time after you die and before you're reincarnated, what happens during that time? Super fascinating, right?
Yeah.
Of course, we did a report on that case. And if you would like to see it, it's here.